Okay, and now that we are here, make sure that you approach this kind of like you would in class with your notes out, ready to fill in. And then also, keep writing in those margins when you have questions and everything so we can talk about it more in class. So looking at federalism, we spent a little bit of time looking at that already with different parts of it and the constant struggle between the different groups that are involved. And really, we have to start with just a pure definition. And I think we have that down, but we're looking at a national government that shares power with state and local. All right, so when we look at it from a constitutional standpoint, it's really based on the powers that are set aside. So we have labels of enumerated powers, concurrent powers, and reserved powers. When they're granted powers, we looked at that list with the articles from the Constitution. Those are enumerated. They're given out. Then there are state powers given to the states. Those are reserved. And then when they are shared, we have the concurrent powers. And this type of government, federalism, with national having power and states, is a relatively new thing from around the world. We have to go back to the fears of the founding fathers when we remember that this is all based on tyranny. What are we worried about? And the big worry is somebody becoming too powerful. And federalism allows that to be stopped, halted. It also really was something new. They weren't sure what every part of the Constitution was going to do. And this is another where they really pulled things together and came up with the idea of federalism because there was nothing like this. No country around the world had a federalist society where both local governments and a strong national government shared power. The other options that were out there, we talked about confederation because that's what we were. We were the Articles of Confederation, and they fell apart. The loose association with states who really control the decision-making, united by just kind of a label. The unitary government is more like a straight line where you start up top and then you just tell everybody underneath, the states, the counties, whatever, exactly what they're doing, and they have to just do what you are or do what they are told by the label above. And when we look at these powers, they are listed. I just want to make sure that you understand when it's given to the federal government, it's an enumerated power. It's not exactly labeled out as a federalist system, but there are powers that are given to the national level. Then there are powers given to the state. Those are specific mentions of the type of government that it is. And then we have federalism as the idea of what they are. And when we decide to label them, what we really look at is the struggle between the two. So you have federal and state. Who has more power? Well, originally, when we look at a dual federalist society, that really means that they're both kind of equal. The national government does their thing, the state government does their thing, and they stay kind of separate. They're in their own sphere. The nickname that people give to this is layer cake federalism. You have two layers of cake, different flavors, whatever you want, and they don't mesh. So states are responsible for governing in a way. There's no crossover. And then the other level, the national government, is in charge of governing, and there is no blend between either way. Cooperative, though, on the other hand, is the blend where maybe states are in charge of this part. The federal government helps them along the way. And you don't really see a definite, this is a state responsibility, this is a federal responsibility. This nickname is marble cake. So if you want to look at, your diagram here, I don't really bake, but we have a layer, which is dual. You have a state set of powers and a federal set of powers, and they never overlap. They stay separate. So each is in charge of their own thing. Marble cake, on the other hand, would be DC having some responsibilities that they share with Lansing. And then kind of the different parts work together to achieve the same goal. Really kind of the invasive part of the national government coming in and taking over states. And really, that is where we are today. We have cooperative federalism, and we're not really going to go back, mainly because of financial things, which we'll look at the end. But we don't have the opportunity to completely split anymore back to just a dual federalism. Dual federalism is definitely a state favorite where they kind of get left alone. States get left alone to do their own thing, to come up with their own stuff and deal with their own issues. Not really an option for many, many different parts of the way society is today, but the focus really probably should be the monetary part of it. Hope you're in class. Now, with the supremacy clause, that's where we have to start with why federalism matters and how they decide. So with federalism, you have two different levels of government. Well, at some point, they're going to fight. They're going to have a conflict. And the case that we looked at really established that, which was McCulloch versus Maryland. But the Supremacy Clause has the Constitution of the U.S. as the main law of the land, the supreme law of the land. It's in there, and it says that this is the supreme law. So when there is a conflict, the Supremacy Clause says that the federal government has the most power. And with that, you kind of have to wonder, well, why do we even have state responsibilities then? Well, the idea is that the national government should only be responsible for what they are supposed to be responsible for. They have a set number of enumerated powers, which are clearly listed, and everything else really should be reserved for the states. Well, they put that in there. The Anti-Federalists, now if you go back, those Anti-Federalists were really in favor of strong protections of states' rights. The Anti-Federalists attached this as a part of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment. Right here, powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, which really means if it is not clearly given to the U.S., the states should be able to do whatever they want. Whatever power is not given to the national government is left up to the states. So in theory, this is huge. This just balloons the number of reserved powers. It's infinite because anything that is not clearly given to the U.S. government should be left to the states. Now, if you're thinking about, well, those enumerated powers then are kind of limited. We went through that list and we named probably 12 different enumerated powers given to the national government, to the powers just from Congress. But there's a clause that we also looked at that really kind of stretched what those enumerated powers are. So this amendment doesn't have quite the impact that they thought it would. It's developed actually a nickname because of it, the sleeping giant, because it hasn't had much impact like it was intended to from an anti-federalist standpoint, an anti-federalist hope, mainly because of that clause that we're getting to. So the three events that have really pushed the conflict between state and national powers, who is supreme, who is a bigger bubble, and really created the cooperative federalism that we know today are right here. McCulloch versus Maryland, we've spent some time on, and I've alluded to the issue of the Commerce Clause, but then also the Civil Rights Movement, where you have to look at states just kind of being stubborn and refusing to do certain things, allowing the national government to step in and show how federalism is a very practical type of government. Just a really quick recap of McCulloch versus Maryland. Again, we do have a lot of Supreme Court cases, so work out something in your head to make sure that you have this. Maryland as a state, well, what did Maryland, the state, want to do? They wanted to tax a federal bank. So we have our two issues then. Could the U.S. create a bank, and then could a state tax it? So the two big outcomes. Number one, the Supremacy Clause. National powers are more important than state powers. So when there's a conflict, the national government is going to be above the state policy. And this was the power to tax is the power to destroy. That is where this one stems from. The other, looking at the can they, well, it's not clearly in the Constitution. It's not an enumerated power, which if you want to be literal, strictly with the 10th Amendment, that means it should be left up to the states. But no, it wasn't. You have to attach that last clause, the necessary and proper clause from Article 1, Section 8. You stretch those powers. Those implied powers are very, very large. They're probably more implied powers that you could make a very real connection to than anyone could ever think. So that clause makes the 10th Amendment almost meaningless because a lot of powers are necessary and proper to carry out the other enumerated powers. So McCulloch versus Maryland it was really important in setting aside those two main principles. Looking at the Commerce Clause, it's also another one of those stretching the power of the national government. The idea is that we have interstate commerce. Interstate commerce is regulated by, or is given to the U.S. government by an enumerated power. Interstate, well, there's a difference between inter and intra. So inter means that it's among many states. Intra would be if it's just within. So your question has to come down to, can there be purely intrastate commerce? Well, yeah, I would say 225 years ago, there was a lot of intrastate commerce where something specifically was made, sold, marketed, everything within a state. As the Supreme Court had to deal with more and more expansion, new technologies, everything, they had to look at again how commerce applies to interstate. When does it actually cross state borders? In this case, this was the big case that dealt with that, Gibbons versus Ogden. This basically said interstate commerce, if it in any way deals with something related to two states, multiple states, then it absolutely could be regulated by the national government. In this case, it was dealing actually with navigation on the waterways, and they wanted to have the ability to tax different steamboats on different rivers, and that was transportation. And let's say you only went with a state to state city. Well, when it went to the Supreme Court, they said that it doesn't matter if it's transportation on a waterway that has the potential to go across borders, that is interstate commerce and therefore can be regulated. So if we are looking at what federalism has really meant, where the national government can put their hand in to different policies, it comes from the Commerce Clause. Now, yes, you have to kind of go back and attach it to the necessary and proper, but at the same time, it is based on the Commerce Clause. They attach everything they can to interstate commerce. And when they are able to do that successfully, the Supreme Court may even back them up like they had to with Obamacare, and they create policy that maybe isn't directly related to interstate commerce, but they find a way to make the connection. Now, the last event would be the civil rights movement. And this is really one of the bad things about federalism is definitely the ability for states to be stubborn, to strike down issues. And that's a big part of why discrimination lasted so long. Segregation of schools ended by policy from the Supreme Court in the 1950s. It went into the 70s for it continuing. So it's not as effective always as it should be. And federalism has to get in to stop that. And that's exactly what happened. They were able to step in and finally were able to pass laws, legislation where states were punished. And that is what they can hold over states. There's really nothing else. It always has to come back in some way to a monetary issue for states to really jump on the bandwagon and do what they're supposed to do from a federal standpoint. Okay, so now that we have those basics out of the way, we have to look at the state-to-state issues. When you were doing your understanding federalism stuff, you were looking at the two clauses. Now, those two clauses come up with horizontal federalism. So that is the state-to-state relationships. And I asked you really to try to come up with them in your own words, kind of understand them. So the two were full faith and credit and privileges and immunities. Well, what do they mean? So full faith and credit. You have one state who is expected to fully accept, fully trust any public record, any act, any legal proceeding. So that means they should give full faith and credit to any law, any document that another state acknowledges. An example of that would be a marriage. If it happened in Michigan and they moved to another state, even if they have different laws on the ages for what it takes to get married, they have to accept it because Michigan legally accepted it and approved of it. Same with adoptions. Same with driver's license. You have to give full faith and credit to whatever document there was. And this is where that gay marriage issue really started to get a national attention, really started to get national attention and realized that it needed to be dealt with because there were couples that were married legally in New York that would move to Oklahoma, and Oklahoma would deny them a legitimate marriage. They wouldn't recognize them when it came to benefits and other procedures that would usually be attached to a marriage. Another part is extradition. If you think about extraditing somebody, Argentina is probably the best example of this. A lot of the fugitives from World War II, the Nazis, went to Argentina because they don't extradite somebody back to where the crime was. Well, we have to. If you commit a crime in Michigan, but you were to travel to Florida or something and hope that Florida's not going to send you back, it's in the Constitution that you have to. Extradition means that you have to be sent back if you commit a crime in another state. They will send you back to be tried where you committed the crime. Then the last part, the other one, in the book, it kind of tells you nobody's really sure what it means. And it's not as big as the full faith and credit one, but privileges and immunities, you should get every privilege and immunity of other people in the state. So you have to do what citizens of that state have to do. If they have to pay sales tax. In Michigan, we have a sales tax. Other states don't. Well, when they come to Michigan, they still have to pay our sales tax. When we travel to Nevada, there is no sales tax. We don't have to pay it. Just because we did in Michigan doesn't mean we have to there. We also can't be treated differently if we're driving on the roads, walking on the street because we're Michigan citizens, but we happen to be in Ohio. You're entitled to the same privileges and immunities of other states or other citizens of that state. Another state hope, push, desire would be nullification. So the idea there is that they can declare a law null and void. If they don't feel like it follows what the Constitution gives them the right to, they thought that they could just wipe it out. This was a big support or thing that was really supported by the anti-federalists with dual federalism, trying to remove the impact of the national government. But the Supreme Court actually said this can't happen. States don't have the ability to say when a law follows the Constitution or not. That is up to only the Supreme Court. So they don't get to do that anymore. They wanted to. They might like the idea that they don't have to follow certain laws if they don't think it follows the Constitution, but they can't do it. That would just create a chaotic storm of states deciding when the national government does and does not follow the Constitution. They are protected, though, too. They aren't ignored in that way. No state can be divided without its consent. Really, now it's not. I mean, we're set with our state borders, but a while ago we weren't. Different states were splitting. Virginia split into West Virginia and Virginia, but that was because of the consent of the state. And then again, we have to. You can't forget the 10th Amendment. Supposed to do a lot. What does it really do? Not much. It's kind of one of those things that the anti-federalists, maybe if they had known the impact of the 10th Amendment, they would have worked harder to clearly identify what the necessary and proper clause could actually mean. Now, individual states do things a little bit different. One thing that you might want to think about is line item vetoes. Line item vetoes are actually given to a lot of state governors, so they are able to do certain things. And these three are all up to the states to decide whether they allow these or not. Initiatives can be signed on petitions, and if there are enough people who sign the petition, it becomes a part of the vote. And these are direct democracy issues. If we look at our representative democracy, well, these are opportunities for a direct democracy. I brought those up last week with Constitution. We didn't spend a lot of time on them, but they all allow a direct vote. So with a referendum, it would be a proposal on a November ballot where everybody in the state has the ability to pass it or shoot it down. And if they pass it, then it is from a direct democracy standpoint. Now, that isn't likely. A referendum is not likely for every issue, but it does happen on ones that are often pushed through with initiatives. The last would be a recall. We have a recall path here in Michigan, recalling representatives at the state level. Recalling Governor Snyder was a big push for a long time, but those are the types of abilities that states can choose to follow, and states can give their citizens if they wish. So on to our last part, and this really is, again, when you look at the struggle, how do you get states to fall in line? The big focus has to be money, something related to monetary issues, and that takes us to grants and aid. So funds from DC to states to run programs, to implement policies, to make their states better. So this is really one of the only things that they do to force states to do what they're supposed to do, follow national policies, and then also it gets states to really kind of, in a way, suck up to DC to get what they need and when they need it. So the grants all do different things, though, and they aren't always for disaster relief. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just for updates. Sometimes they're just for equality, but they all have different purposes, and states want money. There's no state that doesn't want money. When I talked about how do we follow a federal policy at the school level for $10 a kid? Absolutely. You're not going to shut that down just to do something. And that's kind of how those little carrots that DC attaches to things, that's really how they get individual states to do what they're supposed to do. So when we look at the type of grants, there are two main types of grants, and these do align a little bit with what you're looking at with dual versus cooperative federalism. And I want you to really come up with a way to think of these. Now, categorical grants, really what I would think of, attach this to a gift card for a specific store. You get a gift card, but it is only to be used in one place. And that's what a categorical grant does. It's money coming from DC, but it can only be used for one thing. So you're still not going to say no to it, but you might be a little bit restricted on where you can spend it. So a categorical grant, that specific purpose could be you have to spend this money. You get $10 million. Owasso has to, though, update their curbs in the downtown area, their sidewalk curbs. That is what the money has to be spent for. The only thing that you can do then is spend it on that purpose. They have decided what you can spend it on, but that gift card for that specific store has limits. And you're going to fight for them. It's a way for DC, though, to control what states do. They still want the money, but they have to often meet certain qualifications to get them, and they still have to spend it how they are told to spend it. Oftentimes, those conditions of aid, those strings that are attached to it, go along with what states are told to do in other areas. And that's where we get kind of tricky, and it's a little bit of a dominating relationship where DC tells you this is what you have to do or else type thing. And those are where they have to follow the different rules and the different policies. Those conditions of aid often are attached to like matching funds. So you might get $10 million to work on your curb, but you also have to raise $10 million at the same time. So those resources still get used for the curbs in Owasso, but the city of Owasso also had to raise $10 million. Those are often the attachments, the types of conditions of aid that are attached to the categorical grants, the specific purpose. And if you want to, you have to associate this with who actually likes these more. Well, DC gets to control what states do. So this is a national favorite. This is cooperative federalism, really, at its best, where they get a thumb on everything that they want states to do. The two big types of categorical grants are project-based, which is kind of what I was talking about. So, you have to change or you have to improve the sidewalk curbs, or you get $10 million for Owasso Airport or Capital City Airport, and that is what you have to spend it on. That is a project. Now, again, you're going to still want it. That's your gift card to that store. You're going to want to spend the money. It's free money, but you still have to do it where you're supposed to. The other categorical grant for where you spend it, how you spend it, that's kind of, it's a complicated formula where they look at who needs it, what are the different sources of income in the area, and often entitlement programs are attached to this with public housing, how it's built, when it's built, who can live there, and what are the fees for living there. Medicare, are other ways that those formula grants fit what the national government can impose onto states. Now, the other is a little bit more open to states getting big-eyed and really liking what they can do. Now, states with block grants, that's just basically like an American Express gift card. It's not assigned to a specific store. They just get, boom, a chunk of money, and then you say, all right, go spend it wherever you'd like. This is what states like. This is, the anti-federalists would love these. This is a little bit more dual federalism, where you get a chunk of money still from DC, but you get to choose where it goes. So, if that same issue that I was talking about with categorical, with the curbs downtown or something, here's $10 million, go make your downtown better. And you get to decide what that looks like. Or here's $10 million, go improve transportation. And instead of saying go improve your airport, you have to go. Sorry, I just had a student walk in. You have to go and spend it however you would wish. So it's not attached actually to the airport. Just go improve your roads, improve the trails in town, whatever type of transportation connection you want, that is up to you. And this, again, it gives more power back to the state. So that's anti-federalist, that's Republican. This is that big gift card with no store attached, and then you get to spend it on whatever general purpose you want. The other, or this isn't really related necessarily to the type of grant, but this is the one where states really have to be careful on what they do. The mandates. Now, these are rules. These are rules that we're expected to follow. And this is where we were looking at with the scavenger hunt. When you the Americans with Disabilities Act, well, you either do it or you're penalized. And Why this is a problem is a lot of time they don't actually get any money with it. So the Americans with Disabilities Act requires all of these updates to public facilities, schools, courtrooms, anything that receives public money has to have these different ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, requirements, height requirements, ramp requirements, braille requirements, and it is up to the state to figure out they're going to pay that. A lot of times that's really expensive. So while it's very meaningful and it definitely should be a law, states often have issues with them. Sometimes they are very expensive to employ and they get no money attached to it. They might get helped out once in a while, but typically they don't. So Americans with Disabilities Act is the biggest mandate really that's on the national level. The Clean Air Act is another one that's also big, where there are emission standards based on cars and the exhaust. Same idea where they have but this is more on the manufacturers. These acts are mandates that have to be followed and have to be enforced, and it's kind of up to the specific mandate on whether they're going to be funded. If they're not funded, it's still on the states, and they either do it or they lose money. And that money can be in so many different places. It's weird how they make those connections. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, whatever, they don't have to be related to that topic where the penalty might come in. So it's really interesting how they navigate the financial part of that carrot, and you either do this or you don't get your carrot. Okay, lastly, recently we have seen a big trend in a strong push for decreasing the size of the national government. And when I say size, I obviously don't mean geography. I mean like the impact, the influence of the national government. And the biggest really is what we call devolution. This started in the 80s. When we look at our eras, you have to look at Reagan as the start of this devolution revolution, taking power from the national government and trying to squeeze it back and into the state's hands. Block grants went with a huge increase under Ronald Reagan because it's a small national government idea. Give power back to the states. The anti-federalists would love to see this devolution revolution. It's slowed down a little bit with the end of Clinton's term, and a little bit with President Obama. It's kind of put a little bit of a halt on it too. But there still is a strong Republican push for more power at the state level. Try to shrink down the influence of the national government. But you have that conflict again. State to national power. So right away, what does that come from? And it's right here. This is your big state to national issue. We know the supremacy clause. That's there. The big one, though, is the 10th Amendment versus the Elastic Clause. Which one is more important? And really, with the Elastic Clause, if you want to take interstate commerce and define that as anything that sort of deals with interstate commerce, that is almost anything. It very seldom is decided that commerce is intrastate and can't be touched. So this amendment, that sleeping giant, is really minimized by the impact of the necessary and proper or elastic clause. So make sure that you have your questions, and if you have them, we can bring them in. We'll be ready to talk. But if you need to go back and hit anything again, make sure you do, and we'll talk about it in class.